The subject of America and the Great War and the role and the exploits of the American Expeditionary Force in the battles of 1917-18 is something that in the coming year on the Old Front Line I intend to look at in greater depth. We've as yet not really covered much of the aspects of the American involvement in the Great War. So to start that off in some respects, I was really pleased to be joined by Mike from the Battles of the First World War podcast, one of the oldest Great War podcasts that kind of paved the way for the rest of us to do this when we could. And it's wonderful that there is this big selection of First World War podcasts now, and I hope that that will only continue. But if you don't follow Mike on Twitter and you don't listen to his podcast, then all the details of that are on the Old Front Line website with links to his Twitter feeds and to the podcast. So go and check that out because there are some really fantastic episodes to listen to. But I was really pleased to have Mike on for a trench chat, so we'll listen to that now. Welcome to the Old Front Line podcast. Mike Cunha from the Battles of the First World War podcast. Thanks for having me on your show some months ago, and it's great to have you on here. So welcome, Mike.
Paul, thank you. Thank you first for coming on my podcast earlier in the spring, and thank you now for the opportunity to come on your show. I listen to it all the time. Yours and Matt Dixon's Footsteps of the Fallen. They're always like at the top of my queue. And your recent Loose episode was fantastic. Your recent episode on All Quiet on the Western Front was fantastic. So thanks for letting me be on a show that I hold in like really high regard.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you. I mean, yeah, I think it's, your podcast is kind of older than all of ours, really, because you started quite some time ago during the actual centenary, but it is a kind of a golden period for podcasts about the First World War and military history, which is a great thing. So, in terms of your own kind of fascination and interest of the Great War and how you came to do a podcast, a pioneering podcast, really, how did that all come about?
I mean, like my interest in World War I actually like began with when I was like 13 years old. I happened to see on MTV a video by the band Metallica. They had a song called One, and it was a song about a severely wounded soldier. So they happened to use footage from a film called Johnny Got His Gun. I looked more into it and found the book by Dalton Trumbo. I read it all while I was 13, and and then from there we kind of rolled into my teenage years, and we were doing, at the time was the mid 90s. It was the 50-year anniversary of World War II was happening. So I apologize to people who've heard this story before, but like in my teenage need to be contrarian, everybody else is into World War II. I'm going to be into World War I. So, and from there on, it's pretty much continued, ebbed and flowed over the years. But like definitely about 10 years back with the coming of the centenary, I really got interested in it again. And then listening to podcasts, I had the rather arrogant idea that like I could do one of these too. So I started podcasting.
Well, far from arrogant. I mean, they're great. I remember listening to one of your Verdun ones down in Verdun, actually, which is quite a good thing to do.
Oh, that's super cool.
So I'm so glad you did it, because I kind of think that the podcasts kind of give a way of explaining aspects of the First World War that is, in some respects, kind of unique. Really, it's like, for me, standing in front of a group of people on a battlefield tour, but we're reaching a much much bigger audience than 40 odd people on a coach.
Right. I mean, I have the host that I use, Libsyn, like it allows me to see like where my listeners are, like, where the podcast is being downloaded all across the world. And it's like amazing. Like I love it. Like I have one, a couple of downloads coming from like Somalia, like one in Kyrgyzstan and it's Ethiopia, I mean, Nigeria, like Brazil, like countries all over the world. And it's amazing, like the reach that we have. And and I always think of podcasts as like small d, like democratization of media. Like now, just some random guy who reads books and takes notes like can put out a podcast, whereas a generation ago we would have been restricted to major news corporations and everything, and the ability to break into that world. So now we can just do it ourselves. So um yeah.
Yeah, it's a great thing, and I think you're absolutely right about the kind of democratization of history in that way, because anyone can start these things. Anyone with just even basic kit with their mobile phone can do a podcast.
Right. And so the key, I think, is having this ability that I can do this. Like the goal is to be as correct as accurate as possible, and to make as few mistakes as possible. So try to keep a high standard.
We all aspire to that goal. It's a
Right.
difficult one. I don't think a
Yeah.
book's ever been published or a podcast ever broadcast where there's not at least one kind of
Right.
mistake
Right.
in there, particularly when you're kind of talking about something you love and you kind of get carried away. It's very easy to kind of go off down avenues and trip over yourself, but there we are.
Yeah.
It's all good. It's all good. So, I mean, you mentioned about kind of World War II, that for most of your kind of contemporaries, they were looking at storming up Normandy beaches or the fighting in the Pacific and places like that. But there were you entrenched in the Great War, and I suppose for us in Britain, that's kind of difficult to understand because it's such a part of our culture. Whereas in America, that's very different, I think.
Right. So like I've said elsewhere, or at least I hope I have. For us, World War II is our main effort. In the as far as like the world wars go, that's the one where we were involved much more and for a much longer period of time, and where it was really the effects of it were really felt here in the U.S. There was a lot of rationing. A lot of materials were unavailable for many years. No new automobiles were built. Women, were unable to get what were then considered luxury items during those years, like pantyhose. Everything was being used for the war effort. And there are stories from my area here in the U.S. that on May 8th, 1945, when news came that Germany had surrendered, that literally church bells all over this part of Massachusetts were ringing, and people like were stopping their cars in traffic and getting out and hugging each other, and that this global war, at least part of it, had come to an end. We were still fighting Japan at that time, but so I think that for the U.S., like World War II is the heavy effort. And World War I, we also experienced rationing and the dramatic call up of millions of men and everything, but our involvement in it was so much shorter, that I don't think, and then of course World War II eclipsed it. So World War I very quickly like receded into the background. I also feel that World War II has a much clearer sense of right and wrong, good versus evil. I mean, clearly, the Nazi regime was evil, and needed to be dismantled and destroyed. Whereas like sometimes I always think of like, well, sometimes I explain to people like, well, I mean, like, yeah, the Germans released gas, but that's because they managed to weaponize it before the British could, because the British were working on it as well. And all parties used gas shells in their artillery bombardments, the AEF included. So, when you think about those things, like it's a little bit murkier with World War One, but that's what part of the fascination. It's just such a human event. So
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things for me is that when I came to the United States quite a few years ago now, I remember seeing in towns and even kind of what we describe as villages, war memorials from the First World War. I was kind of following the Civil War sites anyway, and I was
Mhm.
kind of surprised to see these because I kind of felt that there possibly wouldn't be that kind of thing in America, but obviously there was. So it's not as if it's kind of not there on the landscape, as it were, but it seems to be ignored in America. Like you say, is it the fact that there is no clear baddie, or or is it more complex than that? Maybe.
I think so. I think it's the shadow of World War II, just like kind of glosses over it. I mean, it's funny. Like I see like World War One like everywhere I go. Like we have a small war memorial in our downtown here, and I live in basically the equivalent of a large village. But we do have them in the cities and towns here. Um, but it's funny, like they just don't get a lot of notice. Like they get noticed by me, like much to the annoyance of my family. Like I'll pull over the car and be like, I gotta go check this out real quick. There's a doughboy right there in that field, and you know, they tolerate it for the most part. But yeah, after post war, like the United States, they definitely embarked on that. I think much like happened in what Europe in Europe with memorial building and everything. It happened here as well. Like Massachusetts itself, like I think there was, I may be wrong on this, so going back to trying to be as accurate as possible, but there were some 6 or 7 thousand men from Massachusetts who perished in World War One. And so, you know, when you think of the 60,000 combat deaths of Americans in World War One, like 6 or 7 thousand came from this state alone. Like Massachusetts paid a pretty heavy price for it. So we have the war memorials around here, and people may not remember them. My local American Legion Hall, like no, I really intend no disrespect to them, but you know they said like, oh, like we named our hall after this one man because he was the only one killed in combat. And I did a little bit of research, and like three others who are on the wall of honor there in the back, they were also killed in combat, you know. And it's like we just forget these stories. Time passes on, and these stories, you know, they become old photographs on the wall, and people forget what the stories were. So
And yet, the American contribution in the First World War was immense. It was a major part of the route to victory in 1918.
yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. So like we went, you know, from the time of our declaring war on Germany on April 6th, 1917, you know, we began with what was basically uh a glorified constabulary of 130,000 men, you know, that we called the United States Army. But very quickly swelled its ranks to, you know, we drafted some 4 million men. Excuse me, sorry. We drafted 4 million men. I believe well over 2 million were sent over to France by the end of hostilities, and of that number of 2 million men, anywhere between a half million and 1.2 million saw or were involved in direct combat operations along the Western Front. You know, at the time that we came in, France and Great Britain, you know, they had been fighting the Germans for 3 years at that point, and were, you know, I won't say exhausted, but you know, you guys had seen a lot and suffered a lot, and we brought like a new infusion into the Allied side. We, you know, as, as much as I would like to be annoying and say as an American, like, well, you know, like we came in and won it for you guys, like it definitely, like that's just a poor joke. I think it was all of us. Like I really do, as cliched as it may sound, like I really think it was all of us working together under uh, Marshal Foch's plan of hitting the Germans everywhere at once. Um, but I think American manpower definitely, you know, lent um, a major contribution towards eventual Allied victory in 1918. I mean, and um, just to mention one statistic, I believe that by the end of 1918, by like the Americans, we were holding the largest sector of the front after the French, who always held the largest bit of the Western Front.
Yeah, and I think there's a note, I think in one of Haig's diaries or a letter, I forget which, where he says if the war continues beyond 1918, that he sees it's definitely going to become an American war, and he ponders on whether the British contribution will ever be remembered if that is the case. considering the size of the American Expeditionary Force. So it's kind of ironic that we're here now talking about how the Great War is forgotten in America.
Yeah, yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, it really is because like even me growing up, like a lot of the books that I read on World War One, it was mainly about the British effort, you know. But I'm limited to what's written in English. My French like remains incredibly poor. And until the time that it improves, like everything I get my hands on is English, and hopefully there's more and more books that have been translated. But yeah, I grew up, you know, like it was the Psalm, it was Ypres, you know, the first, second, third battles, you know, and then in the big fights of 1918, then you start to hear about the American contribution. And this little known, you know, like thing that happened, like the near Verdun, like the Meuse-Argonne offensive, you know, and then I come to, you know, read more about it, and it's, you know, it's to this day the Meuse-Argonne is our largest battle ever. Even, and I know this may irk some World War II historians, but like, yeah, it's even bigger than the Battle of the Bulge, guys. Like way bigger. So
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I wonder because I mean I know there was Pershing who commanded the AEF feared that his kind of force would be split up if he didn't
mhm.
keep his eye on the ball, with units being sent to the British and units being sent to the French to kind of bolster up their line. And the fact that the Americans did eventually fight on their own, as it were, in their own sector, away particularly from their other fellow English speakers, is that kind of maybe how some of this ended up being lesser known, because most British people have no clue as to what the Americans really did.
Yeah, so I do think it's where we wound up on the Western Front, like because when American forces arrived in France, and I'm really gonna paraphrase and oversimplify this, but the leadership in the BEF and in the French army were basically like, you know, hey guys, you know, really appreciate the enthusiasm, but like you don't know what's going on here. Like we've been fighting this war for, you know, for 3 years now. Like you guys need to come under our training for a little bit so that you guys get the lay of the land and how this war works. And I think the Americans in our like naivete and yeah, a little bit of arrogance, you know, we were like, you know, Pershing and his leadership, like they were like, you're gonna tell us what's happening? Like you guys have been sitting here in trenches for 3 years, blowing each other to bits. Like, I'm sorry, like we fight wars with rifles and we maneuver. That's how the job gets done. And so yeah, we wound up having to learn a lot very, very quickly. And we did learn those lessons in the AEF very expensively. I believe, like in our first engagements, like Second Battle of the Marne, and then especially like in the Meuse-Argonne, we learned the lessons that the BEF and the French army learned way back in 1914. Like we learned them quickly. Like the soldiers on the ground began to adapt as quickly as they could. But yeah, they were very, very expensively learned. And I apologize for digressing there, but I think maybe part of why our efforts may not get so much attention is that like while some of our units, namely like the 27th and 30th divisions, went on to fight with the BEF on the Somme, and later two other American divisions fought up near Ypres. We mainly like embedded with the French forces, took our training from them, and then they would put us in a frontline trench and monitor how we did, and then hand off sectors to us. And then in the once the American First Army was created in the summer of 1918, and Pershing secured that Americans were going to fight as a separate and distinct national army, we received French sectors of the line, like the Saint Mihiel sector, the salient there that we eliminated in a couple of days, and then very quickly moved up to the Meuse-Argonne, which was, you know, near the old Verdun battlefield. So, you know, it's funny, like in the 1920s and into the 1930s, the everybody knew about the Meuse-Argonne. It was a huge thing, and the stories that came out of it. You've got Sergeant Alvin York, which was a huge publicity campaign, but also men like Charles Whittlesey and the Lost Battalion, like they were very well known. But just in the 30s, new storm clouds started to form on the horizon, and then World War II came. So those men were, they just fell into the back as the GIs took over from the doughboys.
And that Meuse-Argonne offensive, I mean, you kind of hinted at it there. It's a really important part of not just the American experience in the Great War, but part of its military experience in the 20th century.
Yeah, I really think like in reading through, so having I was in the military for a few years, and it's I always catch myself saying like oh my god, like we would never do that today. Like we would never allow guys to attack without an objective. We would never allow um every soldier to know like what the job was, like that every soldier from you know battalion commander down to the lowest private, like everybody would know like we are taking that hill, we're going to pound it with artillery, and then we're going to attack in this direction. So if all of us die, like what you need to do, you keep going until you get to the top of that hill. But that wasn't the case in World War I, and so it's a great point that you bring up, because I really think that this is where the modern United States Army was born, and we realized, you know, man, there needs to be a lot of like the combined arms offensive, like using infantry, tanks, also air power, artillery, working with the communications of the time, which were very basic and very very rudimentary. I believe there was wireless was just in its infancy in 1918. So we made we made unfortunate mistakes. They were part of, again, a very expensive learning process. And then you've got Pershing for the first time in the United States' history, like bringing millions of men over as an expeditionary force, like to fight in a European war. Like that had never happened before. So everything that Pershing did, like, later Eisenhower studied that later and built off of that. So it was a lot. It was a lot, but yeah, that was definitely the birth of the modern United States military there.
And those are kind of last 6 weeks of the war for America were pretty intensive battles, not just with the Meuse-Argonne, but it continued literally right up to the last moments of the war.
Yeah, yeah. So the Meuse-Argonne was 47 days. 1,200,000 American soldiers involved in that battle. 20 26,000 killed. So you're looking at about, on average, like 500 doughboys being killed every day. And of course there were the bloodletting was different on each day. Like 95,000 wounded. But yeah, and 47 days of continuous fighting, all the way up to the very last moments of the war. And sometimes, there's a lot of controversy in why did attacks continue on the 11th of November, knowing that the war was gonna end. What I have heard, and I, again, I may be wrong or may have misunderstood, but what I've heard is that nobody really knew if the Germans were going to honor this agreement. Like, they had been asking for it on or about November 7th, I believe, and Marshal Foch told the German delegation that, like, okay, like, you're gonna, okay, we'll cease fire on November 11th, but I want you to know, like, I am going to continue attacking you until that moment, because I want you to understand that you are defeated, and that we're going to continue hammering you so that to hold to that ceasefire when it comes. So I believe the Americans took that, those were our orders from Allied command. So we kept on attacking. pushing it until the last minute. Now, were there many officers who wanted to get their their combat stripes? Like, of course, and and I'm sure many American lower enlisted, like privates and sergeants, like, hey, I want to make sure like I get to fire my rifle in anger too. So there was, I'm sure there was plenty of that, but that was our mission, and it was to keep hammering at the Germans until 11 o'clock. But then 11 o'clock came, and then I mean, on the Meuse-Argonne front later that night, on the old Verdun battlefield, I understand that Germans and Americans, like, they lit a huge bonfire in the former no man's land, and were hanging out, like, now suddenly like old friends. Like, it just boggles the mind that
It's
you can
crazy,
do.
isn't it? Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah,
One minute they're enemies, the next minute they're not.
yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that it's because I mean, we did a documentary about the last day of World War One, and we looked extensively at the kind of the American side of it,
Hmm.
and it's easy to criticise it, like at Stenay, where they capture the town of Stenay because it's got baths, and the divisional commander kind of looks at it, and his men will get a bath, but it costs 300 casualties, and that was the price of a bath. There's kind of that side to it, but then you look at the kind of go up the chain a bit towards Pershing. And like you said, they didn't believe the Germans would honour the ceasefire, because that's all it was. The armistice was a ceasefire; it wasn't an end to the war.
Right.
And why not capture positions that you can capture now, rather than have to capture them when the Germans have built up their forces again later on? So I think it was a different mindset to, I think, the British forces at that time, who after 4 long years of war were weary, and no one wanted to be the last man to be killed.
Right. 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 Yeah. And so the Imperial War Museum years ago, they did a great podcast series called Voices of the First World War. And one of the episodes was the arrival of the Americans on the Western Front. And there was it was so cool, because I think a lot of these interviews were conducted in the 1960s, about a half century after World War One. So a lot of these men, the men being interviewed, they were British veterans, and they were older gentlemen, but a lot of them still really sharp memories and everything. And I think one exchange that captured, like, the American and the British sentiment was this British gentleman. I believe he had been an officer, and they said, well, we had some Americans show up in the frontline trenches, and we were supposed to show them around, and kind of show them how things were going, and this American lieutenant came, and was all fit and very motivated, and came with and the the British gentleman, like, he went from his British accent, like, into an American accent, and this American comes and says, where are the goddamn Germans? And I apologize for my terrible British accent here, but he was like, what rubbish? But who would say such a thing? And just like, yeah, that would be us, man. Like, we would say something like that. we're well intentioned, so.
Yeah, I think my uncle was in the Royal Navy, and he landed guys from the 29th Division on Omaha Beach. And he said that they, on the run in, they were saying to him, "Don't you worry." I won't try and do an American accent, but they were saying, "Don't you worry, Limey. The United States is here. We're going to kick down Adolf's front door, and the war will be over." And then, of course, their great tragedy, they all get annihilated by machine gun
Right.
fire.
Yep.
And to a sense, there was a kind of similar thing, I guess, with AEF units, like you've hinted at, with the going into the Meuse-Argonne with those terrible casualties. That's a staggering kind of casualty rate. So when the war ends with what 60,000 combat death in just that kind of 6 week period or whatever it is, America wants to commemorate that not just at home but on the actual battlefields as well.
Yeah. So I think the greatest memorials that we have are the cemeteries that we have there. In I have visited. I haven't visited them all in France and Belgium. So I know two or three. I know the Meuse-Argonne cemetery fairly well. That's in Romagne-sur-Montfaucon. It was on a ridge line that was very heavily fought over by units of the 3rd and 32nd American divisions. right on the where the Germans had their third line, the Kriemhildestellung. It was their third position. It was part of the vaunted Hindenburg line that ran along the Western Front. Um, so that's a very moving monument. We have a few monuments in the area. Pershing, General Pershing was very strict post-war. He didn't want people he didn't want any private memorials dotting the landscape. He was very strict about that. He also didn't want many unit memorials. So if you go out to the Meuse-Argonne, you might see these white obelisks everywhere with a red diamond. Those represent the Fifth Division. My friend Rob Laplander and I, we usually have a joke of was the Fifth Division in France? Like, how can you tell? I believe there was at one point there was about 36 of these white obelisks in the area. Now there's less, due to time, but they hurriedly got those in place before General Pershing could stop them. So, and there's a memorial to the 316th Infantry on a hilltop in the Meuse region that Pershing was also very unhappy with when he saw it being built. But the story goes that local French authorities came and they basically created a French inscription on one side, and they were like, it's a French-American monument, so now it's good to go. And Pershing walked away fuming, I guess. But I think our big memorial, those are the cemeteries, and the just those fields of white crosses. It's just it never ceases to move me, especially the Meuse-Argonne. Like, it just goes on and on and on, and it's very powerful, and it's a very lasting testament. And by saying that, I want you and your listeners to understand that, we'll get into it in a little bit, but having walked the Arras battlefield for the first time, like seeing these smaller British cemeteries dot the landscape everywhere, that's also very moving, in a different way, but yeah, like the American cemeteries are really something. And if you ever get a chance, the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery is, I believe it's the largest American cemetery outside of the US. It contains over 14,000 battlefield casualties, battlefield deaths, most of them from the Meuse-Argonne battle, which all occurred again in a period of 47 days.
It's incredible. I mean, when I take English groups there, the film "Oh, What a Lovely War," which I don't know if you've ever seen that, it kind of ends with Sir John Mills as Douglas Haig standing next to some white crosses, and then it pans out this fantastic shot that was filmed on the Sussex Downs with this kind of endless white crosses. And actually, a lot of them say to me, having seen that film, they say, "Is this where that was filmed?" Because to them, it's kind of exactly what kind of the losses of the First World War should look like, and how they should be represented by this hillside of white crosses. So, and I think that, as allies, we kind of pull each other's legs and we take the mickey out of each other quite a lot. But I think no British group can ever fail to be moved by seeing the cost that America paid in that conflict by standing in a cemetery like that. It's just staggering.
Yeah, yeah, and especially, I mean, again, like with having covered the Somme, and the like, I really came to know the British effort. Like, despite all my reading as a teenager and everything, like, I somehow got into my 30s, like, not quite understanding that the Somme was more than just the 1st of July. Like, it was, it went off 4 months afterwards, and covering the podcast episodes, covering the Somme in the podcast, like, I really came to understand, like, oh my God, like, this was such a massive effort. Like, now I understand why World War I is so important to the British people. Like, the scale of losses that were incurred in just this one battle in 4 months, and then you had 4 years of war. But yeah, like seeing the cemetery at the Meuse-Argonne, you get to really know, and knowing some of the people who are buried there, like, you get to know their stories, and like, they're not it's not just a name on a piece of marble. It's there's a person and there's a story, and some of the like most amazing stories sometimes, that that are now represented there. There's the cemetery superintendent of the Wazane Cemetery. His name is Bert Cloud, and he's a great guy. And a lot of times on Facebook, on his personal Facebook page, like he will post names of soldiers who are buried in his cemetery, and he'll tell a story. Like he does the research on them, and then at the end, he always says, we speak their names, speak their names so that we don't forget them. That's something that's really like really gotten into me. Like he's like, wow, yeah, like you speak their names, and that way they live on. So um that's something that I've tried to do, like with the podcast. Like as long as we speak their names of men who fought at the Somme and Verdun, and now in the Meuse Argonne currently, like they will live on. Like, eventually, like I hope this podcast lasts for a while, and people listen to it for years. But every time they hear that name of whoever's being talked about, like that person, their memory lives on a little bit longer.
It's really important, yeah, and I think that, sometimes we don't even find out about these things, but I'm sure that telling those tales inspires somebody to go there and find that name and seek that grave out and stand at that grave, and that's kind of what remembrance is all about, isn't it, really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you've just come back, well, recently come back from an absolutely epic journey across the old front line. So where did you go and where did you end up?
Man. All right. So if I can start with the day that I left. So in mid-August, I finally had to come back home. Like the missus was very patient with me being out for a month, but it was like, okay, like I'm really glad you're coming home. So but I was at Charles de Gaulle, like checking in my bags, and you're going through the line, and you have the passport check there, and there was a woman was checking my passport, just asking me a few questions, and she was French, and I apologize, like I don't know accents very well, but I do love accents, and she had what I believe to be like an African, uh, an accent of African descent, and it was beautiful. And she was asking me, how was your time in France? And I was like, oh, it was absolutely wonderful, and what did you do? Like, well, just tourism. And she asked me, like, and how long were you in France? And I said, I've been in France for 4 weeks. And she like looked up from my passport. She was like, 4 weeks? Like, and what did you do? What did you see when you were in France? And I was like, ma'am, I saw everything. Like, and I didn't tell her, but yeah, I pretty much saw everything that I could. Like, so I arrived in mid-July. I first thing I did was I went out to the Meuse region and prepared to lead my own battlefield tour with my buddy Rob. So I spent a week preparing for that, and then a week of actually doing the tour. And we went deep, like we went out into the fields and everything. And there was even I told the guys, we'll get you right into it, right into the filth of it. And we did, because we stomped through a field that had just had manure spread all over it. So it was like, what? We told you guys it was going to be real. So uh so that was really a great experience. And I had the guys, the guests we had on the tour, they were just fantastic. I don't think I've laughed that hard in years, none of which I can repeat on this podcast, but it was a great time. Then after that, Rob Laplander and we spent a week working on another project that we have, which is Doughboy MIA, where we're trying to locate and hopefully eventually recover American doughboys who we know that they were killed on the battlefield, hastily buried, and we're trying to locate their remains and hopefully bring them home. in a sense, like, yeah, adding closure to these cases. Sometimes people ask, like, why are you doing this? Like, well, like, because we have the technology today to that can really take us much further than the graves registration services could in the 1920s and 30s. And our country made a promise to these guys that, like, everybody comes home. So and they did the best that they could. The AEF and the GRS afterwards, they really did the best they could with what they had to locate missing men. But we want to try and carry on that mission just a little bit more. And if we can, you know, we would like to bring some of these guys home. So spent a week doing that. We brought Rob's son on a whirlwind tour of Normandy, which was always cool to see. Like, we stood on Omaha Beach on a fine, like, summer evening, and it's a beautiful place, and it's kind of hard to think about, like, what happened there. Like you can't even imagine it. After the Normandy tour, like, I went off on my own, a day in Paris with some cousins, which was an awesome experience as well. And then a whirlwind tour of Ypres and Arras, and of course, like, I used a book called Walking Arras by yourself as the guide to the area. So it was awesome.
Good. No,
Only scratched the surface of Ypres and Arras, and I really hope to return. But it was a fantastic trip. I got to see so much. So thankful to be able to see the cloth hall in Ypres. Something that I've seen in books, since I was a teenager, and I was like, oh my god, like, I'm actually, like, standing here. This is it. This is the building. And there was a there was, like, some kind of town fair happening during the time that I was there. So lots of, like, carnival rides and stuff like that in the town square. So didn't really make the place photogenic, but what the reason I bring that up is that I did go to see the last post ceremony, and it was really moving. I didn't record it. I didn't take any photographs of it. I just wanted to experience it. And it was amazing. Like, at 10 till 8 in the evening, I noticed the thumping techno music from downtown ceased. And then people were talking at the Menin Gate, conversation and everything. But then at 8 o'clock, like, hundreds of people on just an August evening, not a particularly historic date or anything, I don't believe, but just hundreds of people gathering there. And then at 8 o'clock, everybody went silent, and we watched. We just listened to the ceremony. I was far back, but yeah, it's, like, very, very moving, and like, absolutely, like, tears. So it was really something. Like, what an excellent, very moving experience, and what an excellent experience as a whole. I'm very thankful that I got to see that.
I don't think you could spend your entire life on these places, and it would never be enough. I think, but the last post, I don't know how many times I've heard it, but it is always impressive. And I think so many people go there, and you can see all these kind of. It's a modern thing with all the cameras up and the phones and everything. I think just to pause and listen to it and kind of take it in is really important. So I'm glad you had a chance to do that.
Yeah, and to see the Ypres salient, the old salient. There's a gentleman, Roger Stewart, Ypres Battlefield Tours. Like, he took me around, but a friend of mine and I, and I just couldn't, like, one thing that I couldn't understand. The Murs Argonne is a fairly large, wide open battlefield. The Ypres salient, this place that I've read about for years, like, it was like we were at Hill 62, and I was turned around and was like, look right over there, like, those two spires, that's Ypres. And I was like, you're kidding. Like, it's a small
Mm.
place. So that's so many men in the BEF, like, were confined in this salient, under the German eyes for years and years, and that they managed to survive. that anybody managed to survive, especially as the landscape was completely wiped out. Um, I I still found that stunning even in 2022. So
It's interesting. It's I think in this year for me, it's taken on a kind of greater meaning when you stand in the square at Ypres. You know that it was pretty much almost dust by 1918, and that 1,000 odd miles across Europe, a war is taking place again, and
right,
cities are being reduced to dust again.
yep,
And there is this kind of feeling that they too one day will rise like a phoenix from the ashes.
yep. I take solace. Like I always think about, like you have movements like the Nazi regime and other evil, evil regimes that exist throughout history. And I apologize for you know, well, yeah, they are just. I mean, the Nazis were evil. The Soviet regime was fairly evil in the USSR. But I always think those regimes, like, they will never last. Like, they will never last, because like the human spirit will always overcome. Like, they want to dance, they want to laugh, they want to sing, they want to be happy. And I don't mean to make that overly simple, but I just hope to illustrate that, like, the human aspiration towards being happy, towards something better, towards peace. You laugh, you dance, you sing, like when there is peace, and that's when we're at our best. So a city like Ypres, though it may have been knocked down and leveled to the ground by 1918, it was rebuilt, and it thrives today. Like, it was really amazing, especially post COVID. I've really come to appreciate seeing people in crowds, and it was wonderful to walk amongst people in Ypres, and just see Belgian hear a lot of English. Like, I didn't even have to attempt French for a day or two, and it was, but just to see people out having a good time and seeing the carnival rides that was obviously there for kids, it was like, yeah, yes. There was a location, I believe it's near the I I apologize, I don't want to mispronounce this. The Hooge, is that Hooge crater?
Huge, yeah,
Hooge
yeah, huge
crater.
crater, yeah.
So is that the place where, like, right behind the museum there's now a kids like theme park,
Yeah.
right? So we were talking about that while we were visiting the area, and we could see, one of the rides in the background, and like, wow, some people tend to think of this as like disrespectful, and like, me personally, and I speak only for myself, like, I think that's like, no, I would bet that, you know if there's any ghosts of Tommies on the battlefield looking at that, I think they would be like, no, that's okay, like, that's cool, like, we want kids laughing here, it's good. That's what we were here for. So, that's just my personal opinion.
No, I think you're right. It's kind of, what's the meaning of sacrifice? It's to kind of free land and people to be themselves. And if a battlefield's turned into a place where children are happy, then what better use?
Yeah, yeah. And the war, like, there's, like you said, there's a war happening in Europe now, but, like, eventually it will end, and I think, the human spirit will overcome that as well.
And when you're out on the ground on this battlefield trip, having read so much about it and researched so many aspects of it, what kind for you is the big part of that experience? What how does it make you feel when you're on that ground?
Um, so, like, especially like with the Meuse, it's like, in that area, um there's very little has changed in the century since the war ended. And a lot of the villages, though they may have been smashed down to the ground, um they were rebuilt, and the local French population, I guess they told the French government, like, you will rebuild this village, and you will rebuild it exactly as it was before. So, you know nothing is pretty much over a century old, but it all pretty much looks the same. And the villages are still very small. A lot of the ground is still the same. A lot of the woods are still about the same size and everything. And so you really get a sense of, like, wow, like, this is what they were fighting through. And a large part of the Meuse-Argonne, like it was a limited maneuver battle. You know, we were steadily pushing the Germans back. So you didn't have the lunar landscape of Verdun and the Somme and Ypres. So when we're in like the Bois de Zogon near Cunha village, like that's, you know, that's roughly what it looked like. It was probably pretty beat up with some shelling, but it wasn't completely annihilated, you know. So you get the sense of like, wow, this is, you know, I'm walking where they walked, and this is pretty much what they would have seen, you know. So it's very, very, very moving. We visited the site of Lieutenant Sam Woodfill, an American officer who earned the Medal of Honor near Cunel. Same church is there, same church building. You know, they rebuilt the belfry, but the barn that hit a German machine gun nest, like that's still there. It's all still there. It's amazing.
I think that's it, and it's kind of the pages of history come alive when you go to these places, and everything you've read makes even more sense than it did before.
Yeah, yeah. I visited about a year ago in November of 2021. We were there doing some work for Doughboy MIA, and we were in the Argonne, and you know, I got to show, like, my daughter came with me, and got to show her, like, well, like, kiddo, this is the Argonne, and it was cold. It was raining. It was pretty miserable, and everything was muddy. There was two colors. There was like gray and brown, and but you know, going through those forest roads with the fog and everything, I always almost expect, like, I'm waiting to watch like a column of doughboys like come out of the woods and march in front of me. Like I would be completely, you know, unsurprised by, like, yeah, this is it. Like you can still feel the presence of all these men who marched through that area. Like they're everywhere.
The past doesn't seem very far away in these places, does it?
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. And also, you know, like on the Somme and Ypres, to think about, like, I know, like, Hellfire Corner today is like, it's just a traffic circle that, like, with no memorial staying what it was, but like I know it, and I was like, yeah, wow, amazing. Right here, like this would have been such a dangerous place to be a century ago, you know, and can still feel that and really appreciate it, and then look around and see the built up villages and everything, and be like, you know what, like, yeah, like, but life comes back. Life does return always.
Yeah, life renews. And here we are, you know, we're nearly a decade from the kind of Great War centenary now. How do you kind of see the future of the Great War, and in particular, kind of through podcasts?
I think, you know what, I think the Great War will continue to generate interest through podcasts. Because I was expecting, with my own podcast, like in 2018, that I was like, okay, well, the centenary's over, so now you're probably going to watch your download numbers start to drop off as people, you know, move on to other subjects of interest for them, and but I haven't. In fact, like I've continued growing. It's been fantastic, and I mean, I'm not on the Spotify like number one or two, but like I'm very happy with what's happening. Like I get emails from people all over the world, you know, who talk about the podcast, talk about their own interests in the Great War and their own connections, and that's just continued on since the centenary years, and so I think it'll continue, to go on. Here in the US, I think as we get closer and closer to the 100th anniversary of World War II, that will begin to take precedence, like in the kind of national spotlight. But I think World War One will always have a place, especially like in the podcasting world.
For sure. But who knows, you know, I mean, I know you've not seen All Quiet on the Western Front yet, the new version. It's an amazing film. But, you know, who knows? Will this prompt a whole load of kind of further Great War films? And will there finally be a film, for example, about the Meuse-Argonne offensive? And,
Oh
and and
God.
could that suddenly propel the First World War into the eyes of ordinary Americans in a way that it hasn't before?
Oh, I really wish like somebody would get behind it and do that idea, or cover a battle like Blankmont Ridge, like where, the US Marines fought that battle and just suffered unbelievably heavy casualties. If somebody would just do that and give it as accurate a portrayal as they could. I mean, so many of the stories from World War I, like I can't believe like movies haven't been made. I mean, I covered a gentleman. He really interests me, is um, John Lewis Barclay, who in the Meuse-Argonne, like he was a scout. He was always out ahead on his own, or working with two other friends. But he's the one who, found a German machine gun, found thousands of rounds of ammunition nearby, found an abandoned tank, put it all together, like, and he took on a German battalion like by himself, like, and earned the Medal of Honor, like barely survived, but earned the Medal of Honor, and went on to live into the 1960s. And I'm just like, how has like Hollywood not found this story? Like, this is wild that this one person did this, so I mean, as far as like action, that would be amazing, to see that accurately portrayed.
Well, until that day, until I see your name in the lists of historical advisors for that film, we can only but wish.
One can hope, right? One can hope.
No, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. So we'll put obviously links to your podcast onto the Old Frontline website so people can find you. If they're not listening to you, I really don't understand why, because it's kind of really important podcast that you're doing, and it's shining a light on aspects of the First World War that a lot of audiences are not aware of. It's a really good thing. So thanks for coming on, Mike. Thanks for talking about the Great War. I'm sure this will not be the last time that we'll do this, and hopefully one of
Yeah.
these days we'll sit down together on a battlefield on the Western Front and do this live.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be fantastic. And any time, like it, the proverbial door to this podcast is always it's always open for you.
Thanks, buddy. I appreciate that. Thank you. Well, thanks, Mike. Thanks for joining us. And here's to that day then when we're back on the Old Front Line.
Thank you, and you as well.
Cheers, Mike. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.